My sister pushed my daughter into a pool fully dressed. My dad grabbed me by neck to stop saving her. If she can't survive water, she doesn't deserve life. They never expected I'd destroy everything they loved. I was already on edge the moment I pulled into my parents' driveway that Saturday afternoon. Every single time I forced myself to show up at these family gatherings, I'd whisper the same mantra under my breath. Stay neutral, stay calm, keep your distance, don't let them get under your skin. I was 31 years old, a grown woman, a single mother to a beautiful 7-year-old daughter named Sophia. My entire existence had become about one thing: protecting her from the nightmare I'd survived growing up. My parents loved to gaslight me, acting like I was being overdramatic, like I was manufacturing trauma out of thin air. Normal families have conflict, my mother would say with that dismissive wave of her hand. But here's the thing they conveniently forgot. They never went after my younger sister, Vanessa. No, Vanessa was their precious princess, their golden child who could do absolutely no wrong. I was the target, the disappointment, the punching bag they'd been using for sport since I was old enough to form memories. We'd driven over for this backyard cookout because my mother had laid the guilt on thick that week. People are starting to notice how distant you've become, she'd said over the phone, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. Don't embarrass this family just because you can't let go of ancient history. Ancient history. That's what she called decades of systematic emotional abuse and humiliation. Sophia stood beside me near the patio, still wearing her purple leotard and black leggings from gymnastics practice that morning. She hadn't wanted to change because she was so excited, thinking she'd get hot dogs and get to play with her cousins by the pool. She had no idea what kind of viper pit we'd just walked into. Vanessa strutted out onto the deck in her expensive designer sundress like she was walking a runway at Fashion Week. She looked Sophia up and down with this absolutely disgusting sneer on her face, like my daughter was some kind of defective merchandise at a clearance sale. Wow, Vanessa said loud enough for everyone to hear, that cruel smirk twisting her lips. Still can't afford to dress her like she matters, huh? Sophia's little shoulders slumped forward, her eyes dropping to the ground. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. Not today, I told myself, fighting every instinct screaming at me to tear into her. No confrontations, no explosions, don't give them the satisfaction. But Vanessa wasn't finished. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice to that venomous whisper I knew so well. You honestly believe that kid's going to amount to anything? You're raising a worse version of yourself. I didn't respond. I refused to give her the reaction she was hunting for. My mother, standing just a few feet away with her wine glass, actually laughed like Vanessa had just delivered the punchline of the century. That's what happens when you make poor choices with men, Mom chimed in, shaking her head with mock sympathy. Garbage in, garbage out. Sophia's small hand found mine and squeezed tight. I squeezed back, my heart breaking into 1,000 pieces while I kept my face completely blank. My father appeared behind me, and I could smell the beer on his breath before he even spoke. You look absolutely miserable, Michaela, he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of disappointment he'd perfected over the years. Maybe if you'd tried being more ladylike when you were growing up, you wouldn't have ended up a single mother living in that sad little apartment. This was their favorite game, their twisted version of family bonding, psychological warfare disguised as concern. They took turns circling me like sharks who'd caught the scent of blood in the water, waiting to see which comment would finally make me snap so they could call me crazy and unstable. I took a deep breath and turned to Sophia, forcing my voice to stay gentle and calm. Baby, why don't you go sit by the edge of the pool and watch the water? I'll fix you a plate with extra ketchup, just how you like it. She nodded and walked toward the deep end, her purple leotard bright against the afternoon sun. I turned away for maybe 5 seconds. 5 seconds to grab a paper plate. 5 seconds to try and compose myself. 5 seconds that changed absolutely everything. When I spun back around, my heart stopped dead in my chest. Vanessa was standing directly behind Sophia, And before I could even process what I was seeing, she shoved my daughter with both hands, hard, straight into the deep end of the pool. Fully clothed, purple leotard, black leggings, sneakers, everything. The scream that tore out of my throat didn't even sound human. It was raw, primal, the sound of every protective instinct igniting at once. I bolted toward the pool, my feet barely touching the ground. Sophia was sinking. Her dark hair spread out around her head like ink dissolving in water. She wasn't coming up. She was 7 years old, and she was panicking, thrashing, sinking. I was 3 feet from the edge when my father's arm wrapped around my throat from behind and yanked me backward with brutal force. "Stop," he snarled directly into my ear, his forearm crushing my windpipe. "She needs to learn to handle herself. If she can't survive water, she doesn't deserve to survive at all." I clawed at his arm with everything I had, my fingernails digging into his skin hard enough to draw blood. My entire body was shaking with pure, undiluted terror. I was screaming Sophia's name so hard my vocal cords felt like they were tearing apart. Vanessa stood at the edge of the pool, arms crossed, actually laughing. My mother was right beside her, sipping her wine, watching my daughter drown, like it was afternoon entertainment. Sophia was underwater. My father's arm was crushing my throat. The edges of my vision started going dark, because rage and panic and absolute horror were all colliding in my brain at the same time. I kicked backward into my father's shin with every ounce of strength I possessed. He stumbled, his grip loosening for just half a second. That was all I needed. I tore myself free from his grip and dove into that pool fully clothed, shoes and all. Nothing else mattered except getting to my daughter. Sophia's eyes were open underwater, wide and terrified, searching desperately for me. She was still conscious, but fading fast, her small arms reaching upward. I wrapped my arm around her chest and kicked us both toward the surface with everything I had left. When I finally got her out of the water, she was coughing violently, choking, gasping for air that wouldn't come easy. I held her against my chest, both of us dripping and shaking, and I looked back at them. My sister stood there with that same self-satisfied smirk on her face, like she'd just pulled off some brilliant prank. My father straightened his shirt like he'd simply prevented me from overreacting to nothing important. My mother rolled her eyes dramatically and said, in that bored, dismissive tone, "Always such a drama queen, Michaela. It was one little dip in the pool." One little dip. My daughter had nearly drowned. My father had physically restrained me from saving her, and they were acting like I was the problem. I held Sophia tighter, feeling her small body trembling against mine, hearing her struggled breathing, and something inside me fundamentally shifted. It was like a door slamming shut and locking forever. This wasn't a family anymore. This had never been a family. This was a group of people who'd been systematically destroying me for 31 years, and now they'd crossed a line I never imagined they'd cross. They'd put my child in danger. They'd tried to stop me from protecting her. Right there, soaking wet, holding my daughter while she coughed up pool water, I made a decision that would change everything. Their world was about to collapse, and they wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands before I could second-guess myself. Sophia was still coughing, her breathing raspy and wrong, a thin line of foam at the corner of her mouth. I dialed 911, my voice surprisingly steady as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. My daughter was deliberately pushed into a pool and held underwater. She's 7 years old. She's conscious but having trouble breathing. We need an ambulance immediately. The operator stayed calm and professional, instructing me to keep Sophia warm and position her on her side. The paramedics arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 8 minutes. They were efficient and kind, immediately taking control with the kind of quiet competence that made the panic in my chest ease just slightly. They wrapped Sophia in thermal blankets, checked her vitals, listened to her lungs, and told me they needed to transport her to Riverside General Hospital for observation and monitoring. I climbed into the ambulance with her, sitting beside the stretcher with her small hand gripped tight in mine, watching her eyelids flutter as she fought to stay awake. Behind us, through the ambulance windows, I could see my parents and Vanessa standing in their perfect backyard, finally starting to realize that something had shifted. At the emergency room, they ran a full battery of tests, while I sat in a plastic chair that squeaked every time I shifted my weight. The nurse who stayed with Sophia while I filled out paperwork had this look in her eyes that I recognized immediately, the look of someone who'd seen family dysfunction disguised as accidents before. The ER doctor who examined Sophia asked very specific, very pointed questions that made it impossible for me to minimize what had happened. Who was supervising your daughter by the pool? Who pushed her into the water? Who physically restrained you when you tried to help her? I answered every question truthfully, my voice flat and mechanical, like I was reading from a script I'd been rehearsing in my head for years. They took detailed notes. They photographed the bruises on my arms where my father had grabbed me. They documented the timeline of events with clinical precision. When the hospital social worker sat down beside me in that tiny consultation room, she spoke gently but firmly. I'm required by law to file a report with Child Protective Services. Your daughter was deliberately put in danger, and an adult prevented you from intervening. This is serious, and we need to ensure Sophia's safety moving forward. I didn't argue. I didn't feel defensive. I just nodded, feeling something like relief wash over me for the first time in years. Someone was finally listening. Someone was finally taking this seriously. The police arrived about 40 minutes later, two officers who took formal statements from me and from the ER staff. They explained they'd be visiting the scene, photographing the pool area, and interviewing witnesses. One officer, a woman named Detective Torres, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, asked if anyone else had seen what happened. I gave her the names of 3 cousins who'd been there, people I knew had witnessed everything, but had always been too scared of my parents to speak up. We'll follow up with them, Torres said, making notes in her little spiral notebook. By the time we were cleared to leave the hospital 6 hours later, Sophia was exhausted but stable. Bundled in blankets and leaning against my shoulder in the back of a taxi. Detective Torres had walked us out and handed me her card, along with information about a CPS caseworker who'd be contacting me within 24 hours. We've filed an official report, and this has been flagged as requiring immediate follow-up, she explained. Someone from Child Protective Services will reach out to you before Monday. The bureaucratic language felt cold and clinical, but underneath all that formal procedure was something I'd never had before. A system that could actually stop my parents from having access to my daughter. That night, I checked us into a budget hotel across town, somewhere my parents wouldn't know to look. I couldn't go back to my apartment yet, not until I knew what protections would be put in place. Sophia fell asleep almost immediately, her small body finally relaxing after hours of stress. I sat in the chair by the window, watching her breathe, and felt the weight of what I'd set in motion beginning to settle on my shoulders. The CPS caseworker, a woman named Donna with kind eyes and a sensible pantsuit, called at 7 the next morning. She arrived at our hotel room by 9, carrying a leather portfolio and speaking in clear, direct terms about what would happen next. She explained emergency safety plans, supervised visitation protocols, temporary protection orders, and coordination with Sophia's school to ensure she could never be released to my parents without my explicit written consent. Hearing these mechanisms of protection described so matter-of-factly made something inside me finally unclench. There were actual tools available, real legal structures that could enforce safety instead of just begging for it and hoping people would show basic human decency. I signed every form Donna put in front of me. I handed over my phone containing years of saved text messages, voicemails, and recordings I'd been too afraid to use. The cruel comments, the belittling messages, the threats disguised as concern, all of it. Donna cataloged everything as evidence. She called Sophia's school, spoke directly to Principal Anderson, and by lunchtime, Sophia had a confidential safety alert in her student file. Teachers and administrative staff were officially notified to never release her to anyone without verified authorization from me or from CPS directly. The school assigned Ms. Patricia, the guidance counselor's assistant, to personally escort Sophia if there were ever any concerns about pickup. That kind of bureaucracy, the kind that actually protected vulnerable people, moved like a shield wall forming around us. I didn't stop there. I reached out privately to Pastor Graham at the church my parents attended, the one where they loved to sit in the front row and perform their perfect family routine for the congregation. I gave him a factual, unemotional account of what had happened: a child deliberately put in danger, witnesses who saw it occur, and a parent who physically prevented rescue. Pastor Graham didn't make a public announcement or turn it into some dramatic sermon illustration. Instead, he quietly contacted the Church Leadership Council and the Volunteer Coordination Committee. Within 72 hours, my father's name had been removed from the youth ministry volunteer roster pending investigation. No viral social media post, no public shaming, just institutions quietly closing doors that had always been open to him. I also contacted two people I'd always considered reasonable in my parents' social circle: my Aunt Christine and my mother's longtime friend Barbara. I presented them with calm, verifiable facts and asked for a simple boundary: no unsupervised contact with Sophia, no social events involving children until the investigation concluded. To my genuine surprise, Aunt Christine responded within an hour. I had no idea it had gotten this bad. That should never have happened to Sophia. I'll make sure my kids don't go over there until this is resolved. It was a small thing, but it mattered enormously. The social shield was assembling around us, quietly and deliberately, without spectacle or drama. My attorney, a family law specialist named Lawrence Brennan, who came highly recommended, drafted an emergency protection letter and filed it with both the police department and CPS. The letter detailed the pattern of abuse, the immediate danger, and the need for enforceable boundaries. We weren't seeking headlines or revenge through public humiliation. Act 6. Systematic Dismantling, 550 words. Behind the scenes, I built what my attorney called a practical fortress. I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to verified safe contacts. I set up a separate mailing address through a P.O. box service for all of Sophia's school documents. I installed new deadbolt locks on our apartment door and added a security chain. These were small, bureaucratic moves that cost almost nothing but provided layers of safety that felt substantial and real. I arranged for my friend Natasha to be listed as Sophia's emergency contact for after-school activities. I enrolled Sophia in swimming lessons at the community center, where instructors were specifically trained in water safety and child protection protocols, and I scheduled sessions at times when my parents couldn't possibly show up without advance notice. I taught Sophia how to float properly and how to call for help in a calm, clear voice. I framed it as empowerment rather than fear, giving her tools instead of trauma. And then I made another set of strategic decisions designed to make my parents feel loss in the places where they'd always felt pride. My father had built his entire social identity around being the host, the guy with the gorgeous backyard and the impressive pool, the man who threw barbecues where his buddies showed up with their expensive trucks and craft beer. I canceled our attendance at the next family gathering, not with drama or a confrontational post, but by calling his closest friend, a man named Greg, who frequently co-hosted these events. I explained the situation in plain, factual terms. I can't bring Sophia to gatherings at their house given what happened last weekend. Greg, to his credit, took it seriously. He confirmed privately that the next cookout would be adults only and held at a different location entirely. That gutted my father's social stage. He noticed the sudden absence of the applause and admiration he craved, and he didn't even fully understand why it had evaporated so quickly. I didn't call news stations or post dramatic exposés on social media. I didn't weaponize their shame on public platforms. Instead, I used structure, medical records, police reports, school protection protocols, church volunteer policies, and community accountability to systematically remove their access and privilege. The difference between that approach and public spectacle is crucial. Spectacle feeds their egos when they get to play the victim card. Structure removes the actual levers they've used for years to manipulate and hide behind consequences. At night, I would rock Sophia in our small apartment and tell her stories about brave explorers who learned to swim in magical oceans. Not to remind her of the trauma, but to teach her she could be more than her fear. She started sleeping through the night again. She began eating full meals at breakfast. She picked up her colored pencils and started drawing again. Watching her small, steady recovery, while the people who'd caused her harm were being systematically cut out of their comfortable roles, felt like a new kind of justice, one that left them smaller and more isolated, not through shame campaigns, but through the quiet evaporation of privileges that had allowed their cruelty to be normalized for decades. Act 7. The Final Confrontation. 550 words. 1 week after the incident, I returned to my parents' house for one specific purpose: to collect the remainder of Sophia's belongings that had been left there over the years. I didn't go alone, vulnerable and isolated like I would have in the past. I arrived with Donna from CPS and Officer Martinez from the police department. No emotion, no shaking voice, no begging for understanding. My father opened the door looking genuinely confused, like he still believed somehow that the world would reset itself and I'd eventually get over it like I always had before. My mother tried to start her usual routine immediately, her voice dripping with exasperation. "Oh, for crying out loud, Michaela, you're dragging this out like some kind of daytime television drama. You've always loved attention more than anything else." Officer Martinez cut her off with professional efficiency. "We're here to retrieve the child's personal belongings. This is not a discussion or a negotiation." Vanessa tried to follow me upstairs toward Sophia's room, like she still had some kind of authority over my life and my decisions. Donna stopped her with one raised hand and a voice that left no room for argument. "You are not permitted to be involved in this process. Return to the living room immediately." Vanessa actually froze, probably for the first time in her spoiled life, and backed away slowly. I went upstairs and methodically packed everything: Sophia's favorite stuffed animals, her sketchbooks, her pajamas with the stars on them, her hair ties, her little backpack shaped like a ladybug. Everything that mattered. When I came back downstairs carrying 2 bags of her things, my parents were standing in their pristine living room, looking like children who'd just realized no adult was coming to rescue them this time. I looked my father directly in the eyes for the first time in my entire life without feeling that familiar wave of fear and intimidation. "You will never have access to my daughter again," I said, my voice steady and calm. "Not supervised visits, not public events, not holidays, not at school, not ever." He tried to laugh, that pathetic half-laugh he used when he thought he could intimidate people back into submission, but it died halfway out of his mouth. Because at that exact moment, Officer Martinez handed him the official emergency no-contact order that had been approved that morning by a judge. He wasn't legally allowed within 500 feet of Sophia. My mother wasn't either. Vanessa wasn't either. It wasn't a suggestion or a request. It was a court order, already filed, already active, already enforceable with immediate arrest if violated. He didn't get a warning. He didn't get a chance to argue or manipulate or twist things around. It was already done, already real, already permanent. That was my revenge, not a dramatic speech or a viral video. I had demolished the only weapon they'd ever had over me: access. I walked out of that house with Sophia's bags in my hands, Donna on one side, Officer Martinez on the other. Their faces looked like someone had physically removed their oxygen supply. Not because they felt guilt or remorse, but because for the first time in their lives, I had taken power they couldn't touch, couldn't twist, couldn't destroy. And as that front door closed behind me, they finally understood. They hadn't just lost an argument, they'd lost us forever.